Good morning, everyone. As I said yesterday, it's a great pleasure to be back here in India. Can maybe we have the light on so I can see my paper, just in case? Not that I'm reading off of notes or anything. This is all in my head. The first thing that I want to really note is that yesterday was the first day of the festival, and I have to say that I heard from a number of presentations, including media, science, arts, and then questions that came from the audience on numerous occasions, which really focused on the notion that conservation must include people. Now, the first thing that struck me really was that it seemed to be an accepted premise here in India that, in fact, if you didn't include people in the proposals for conservation, you could not succeed. But the fact of the matter is that in most places around the world, I have found that that is a very controversial approach. That conservation, by and large, has existed on its own. That the science behind it is somehow separate from what is happening around the animals themselves. So, in my job, it's getting darker and darker here. In my job, I travel around the world. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I travel around the world, and I make a habit of putting myself in situations that are often uncomfortable. And I do that because I think we need to avoid talking to ourselves. Yesterday, I asked everyone in the room, how many of you love elephants? How many of you think we should save elephants? So let's start there. How many of you think we should save elephants? Right. So almost everyone in the room. But the question is, why? Why save elephants? Have you thought about that, or is it just something that you were told was important, or your personal predilection is that we should save elephants? Coming up with the reasons why we should do this, though, are far more complex than simply saying, I love elephants. So I think that in India, I have to say, you are already starting in a very good place. There seems to be a large consensus around some of these approaches that I just don't find in many places around the world. Some organizations, in fact, and I think that India has experienced some of this, some organizations have gone so far to really lay out the fact that conservation is the enemy. This is something that I've come upon fairly recently, and I was very surprised. And it's based on an approach around human rights. That people must come first, and that's something hard to disagree with. But it's not just that. It's that they have set out to prove the point that conservation itself diminishes human rights. So it's one or the other. And this is what I always try to focus on, is that for a long time conservation was about the animals, and the backlash to that is let's focus on people, and that there can't be any coming together of those two things. So when you see that type of attitude, and believe me, for whatever purposes, and I think it's political, but if you go online and look at organizations that put themselves forward as protecting indigenous peoples, tribal peoples, communities at large, they set out to say that conservation is the enemy. And where this will lead us, I'm not really sure. I think it's going to be an issue here in India in particular. And I find myself in the crosshairs. I get emails from leaders around the world who will look to find fault, whether it's how we present the importance of elephants, or how we present the importance of landscapes, or how we present the importance of women. And it's to tear down any sort of effort that puts animals and people together. So a little bit of a surprise. It means to me that we can never rest. We can't rest on the laurels of we've saved so many elephants. I'm also incredibly energized, I must say, by visits to India. Because you're constantly surprised. I'm constantly surprised by some of the things that I come into contact with. I mentioned yesterday that Vivek, with whom I've worked for 20 years almost, and we have had many adventures. And we were discussing conservation, and there's all sorts of assumptions that people make, like conservation is 150 years old. It's a North American model. This is what it means. And Vivek pointed out, in fact, that it was in India a 2,000-year-old message with the establishment of the elephant gardens. Now, I took that information and I presented it in France. And I had a woman stand up who was very hostile. And she said, that's absolutely not true. That cannot be true. France is a great leader in conservation. France has done this. France has done that. And I said, no, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. I then learned that, in fact, I was wrong, and it wasn't 2,000 years old. It was 2,500 years old. But I mentioned that story because of the animosity. There was an animosity towards what I was saying. Now, unfortunately, a very senior level person, who was in fact a minister, went on to suggest to me, would IFAW pay to move all of the elephants from Africa to the south of France? I hesitated. I said, well, Vivek maybe has the money to do that. But what do you say to something like that? And why is that person, a policymaker, a senior level policymaker, asking me a question like that? Now, deep down, I know it's because they wanted to protect elephants. They wanted elephants to be safe. There's also an element of racism, I'll be honest with you, that there are people around the world, and you see this often, who put forward that, in fact, Western Europeans, Americans, North Americans, can do a better job of saving the lives of elephants than can the people that live with elephants. So what is it that they are after? Are they after some sort of sanctuary? A removal of elephants to simply protect their lives? Or are they looking at the landscape and the habitat and the ecology and how people interact and how they interacted 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago? And perhaps they're not aware that, in fact, people have lived with wildlife and lived with elephants for many, many thousands of years. But those are the things, those ideas are the ones that you will see on social media. So this whole advent of what is happening on social media is something that we need to deal with as well. And I personally often get very discouraged when I read some of the things I see on social media because people are shutting down that the problem is too big. We cannot save elephants. Now, we often say that there's an elephant killed every 26 minutes, and that elephants will go extinct. Vivek mentioned this yesterday, and to the young people I see here today, don't right away write that elephants are going extinct. Elephants are not going extinct. There is pressure on certain populations. But whilst we are sitting here talking, 2 more elephants in Africa will die. Not too long ago, we talked about elephants were killed every 15 minutes. So have we made progress? If we have slowed the killing of elephants from 1 every 15 minutes to 1 every 26 minutes, have we made progress? The question at hand is, are we succeeding? With all of the efforts, and I must say that I think that over the last 5 years, we have made enormous progress in getting the issue into the media. I think that we have struggled previously to wake people up, to talk about what is happening. Now, some of that is, due to the poaching, all right? And as an organization ourselves, we struggled with this notion of, are we more concerned with ivory and how to stop it being traded and being sold? And we have projects that are aimed to do that in China in particular, but also in the United States, which is a very large ivory market. But at some point, I realized that most of the efforts were focused on ivory. And what it really brought home for me was sitting in a meeting with the Clinton Global Initiative with elephant experts from Africa and those who are concerned with African elephants sitting in the room. And we divided ourselves into groups. Stop the killing, which is about the poaching. Stop the transit, which is about trading through, we were focused on the Middle East. And then reducing the amount of ivory that was sold in China. All right? So there were 3 groups. And I was asked to lead the part of the discussions that focused on stop the killing. Now, there are about 50 people in that room. And when time came to divide into 3 groups, I would say that 70% of the people went to decrease demand in China. 20% left to talk about trade. And I basically found myself alone. Now, I had showered that day, so I knew it wasn't a personal thing. But I looked around the room, and there were about 3 people with me, and I thought to myself, something is very wrong. Because at the end of the day, what do we really care about ivory? If we stopped ivory being sold, and if we stopped ivory being traded, and elephants continued to die, then we had not succeeded. And I had to stop the meeting and stand up and say, listen, the ivory is not what matters. It's keeping the elephants alive. Why did that happen that day? And this comes down to a theme that I'll mention a few times as we go through. Money. It was about money. The donors around the world wanted to focus on reduction of buying ivory in China. China was the bad guy. And if we could just destroy the markets in China, we would save elephants. Clearly not true. Clearly not true. Because you could see that in that time, elephants continued to die. Now, since then, we've made some progress when things shifted to keeping elephants alive and not looking at the products. But it was a major, major hurdle around the world. I'm often asked, why should we save elephants? Why? This talk is titled The Imperative to Save Elephants. Why? Why do we have to save elephants? These are the questions that I get. And I believe in myself attending meetings where I'll be attacked. Hopefully this is not one of them. But if we're only speaking to ourselves, we never really make the progress that we need to make. The question that I get is, I want you to tell me how much better my life will be because we have elephants in the world. I want the economic answer. Will I have more money in my pocket? Will I have a bigger house? Will I have a bigger yard? How will it change my life? Probably the most cynical question that I think I've ever got is, what will happen to me if all of the elephants in the world die? And I began my career trying to answer that question. I really did. And I came up with all of the reasons that, people told me. But in the end, I found it was just an incredibly cynical question, that I'm not sure that that person will ever accept the answer. And I boiled all of that down to one question. And that question is, are you willing to share the earth with any other animal? Are you willing to share the earth with an elephant? Now, to my surprise, I was told by a number of people, no, I'm not. I'm here to kill that elephant, sell it, and if I can make money, we're all better off. I tried the arguments. What about your children? Don't you want your children to see elephants? Don't you want your grandchildren to see elephants? They said, no, I don't really care about my children. I'm here to make money. So that's a pretty cynical view. And I share that with you because if you think you'll go out and are inspired by the art and the music and the dance and the talks, you need to learn the lesson that you need to gird your spine and prepare for some very, very difficult discussions. I think that it lures you into an argument that is really devoid of any soul, honestly. And presenting in front of people called the wise men in New York City, they told me that I was a failure because I had not convinced them that they would be better off with elephants in the world. And so you have to walk away sometimes. The economic problem, is my life worth more than an elephant? They want that answer. And if you tell them that their life is perhaps less valuable or more valuable, they want the numbers. They want you to prove it. One of the things that I noticed when I first started working for IFAW and conservation was that I quickly came to the conclusion that there are no animal problems. There are people problems. Now, the scientists didn't like that. They said, no, there's management and there's ecology and there's biological management. And I said, that's all true. There's disease. Clearly, animals face problems. And that's not what I'm saying. But the problems that animals face for their own survival really have to do with people over and over and over again. So this notion that we face often is results in that question of, hey, let's just move the elephants to France. Right? You save the elephants, we're all set. They're safe, I'm safe. I don't know who's going to pay for it. I don't know if elephants like the south of France. But that was the proposal, and it was by someone in a very high position. I think that the overall question of economics it's an insidious one. And oftentimes I will hear, if the elephants cannot pay for themselves, they have to die. So that's a whole philosophy. And you'll probably hear about that as we go through some of the presentations. If they can't pay, they have to be wiped out. Pay for what? End of the day, what are they paying for if they have no value? All right, so no economic value. So at IFAW, we talk about the intrinsic value of animals. And when I say intrinsic value of animals, what I mean is that they have a worth, they have a value, whether or not someone else has assigned an economic value. But the flip side, if you answer that question, that if you cannot prove they have economic value, then let's wipe all of the animals on the face of the earth out. I've never had anyone give me the answer as to what Earth will look like once that is done. A lot of times I talk about the science and what is truth. So am I telling you the truth here this morning? Am I telling you the version of my truth that I've gathered through all of the observations that I've made? One of the very first meetings I attended at IFAW, I sat down with a scientist. They wanted some money to create a CD. And so I said, all right, well, what's on the CD? And they said, the truth. The truth is on the CD. And I said, well, what will you do with it then? She said, oh, well, then all you have to do is distribute the truth, and then animals will stop being killed. Now, that person believed that because they have a great sense of what the truth can do. Unfortunately, I think that if you look at the example of climate change around the world, it doesn't matter, at least in the United States, I'll say right now, it doesn't matter what truth you have. You will not convince anyone that, that climate change is a problem. We're going to hear, I think, a little bit later on about, or during the rest of the week, about how animals are adapting to climate change. And that's something that we pay a lot of attention to. And looking at issues of land and how animals use land as opposed to just land that's set aside. Well, that was fast. The theme of this gathering is bringing the world together to help elephants. Right? And I'm going to put forward a thesis that maybe you'll be happy to rip apart. But I think that there are some instances where the elephants themselves are beginning to help us achieve that goal. And I'm going to give you an example of it a little bit later. One of the things that we talk a lot about at IFAW is conservation and what is the definition of conservation. And I think that traditionally that has focused on populations, right? You'll see it, and I do spend a lot of time with professors who are teaching. I want to see their books and to see if the definition of conservation has changed at all. And by and large, it really hasn't. And there's still this focus on populations as opposed to individual animals. And if you bring up individual animals, typically you're accused of being overly emotional. And my argument about that is, in fact, that it may well have been true, when there were millions of animals or hundreds of thousands of animals within a particular population. But when you look at some of the numbers now, the threat against a population of 400 individuals or 500 individuals or 1,000 individuals is not what it was many, many years ago. So at IFAW, we put a lot of focus on thinking about how we can redefine conservation to include, I think, an emergingly credible biological description of individual animals and animal behavioral sciences. It depends on where you go. Some scientists are willing to accept that. Others are still telling me at IUCN that it simply doesn't matter. Simply doesn't matter. So that's one of the big things that we are up against. I recently had a chance to visit someone who's doing some incredible work in Mozambique, who is setting out to change the very nature and very definition of a national park, which I think is a good thing. I would like to change the definition of conservation, and not to tear what's already there down, but to add the behavioral sciences to include what we know and have many examples, including here in India, that when you pay attention to individual animals, you will have a better conservation outcome. And there are many examples, and I won't bring them up specifically, but if you look or are aware of what happened recently in Kenya with the transfer of 18 rhinos, 11 of whom died because they didn't have clean water, and there really wasn't any focus on what those animals needed as individuals. And that's equally true in the past when we look at some of the issues with elephants. Fundamentally, my challenge back to conservationists who don't like what I'm saying is, if your construct was so good, then why have so many animals died? If you are sure that there's only one way to look at conservation, there's only one way to protect elephants, and we've gone through all of these times when elephants have been killed, why aren't you able to admit that there might be another way? I've also had some incredible experiences here in India, not with Indian colleagues, I might add, where I learned for the first time that there were people who thought that the solution was elephant farms. And at first I thought they were kidding, because I couldn't even comprehend what were they talking about. Putting elephants in barns or somehow corralling them, cutting off their ivory, letting them live in that condition for their entire lives, and then cut off the tusks again. Things can get very, very heated. We were in a meeting where we brought some African ministers together with Indian colleagues, and I proposed that we should avoid things like this concept of elephant farming, and a minister called me out and said he would like to put a gun to my head and blow my brains out. So if you were thinking that these are genteel and polite conversations, I'm just letting you know that if you want to be a warrior for elephants, you want to be an advocate for elephants, you will run up against people who are very, very difficult. The notion of how people are involved. In many parts of the world, 80% of animals spend 80% of their time outside of national parks. How can you tell me that people cannot be involved? For many, the response to that is, yeah, no, we involve communities. Basically, it boils down to trophy hunting. And the reward is throwing them a bone, literally. We killed the animal, we gave the natives, and this is what I've been told, we gave the natives some meat. And you should have seen how happy they were to dance around the meat. Now, I cannot think of anything more racist than simply saying to the communities, here's a bone, here's some meat, be happy with that once a year, and we'll just go on our way. And that's conservation. Just in Kenya, we are working with a number of women's organizations to get them involved in protecting the There was a senator that she wanted to talk to me and tell me something that was perhaps personal. And I noticed that she had formed a group of women, and they had on their shirt sleeve a patch where they were milking elephants. And I asked her, I said, well, I hope you're not really trying to do that. And she said, no, but what we want to get across is that we understand that elephants live life. She then looked at me and said, I used to believe that all wildlife and all elephants belonged to white people. But now I understand that we are responsible, and they give us life as women in the world. So that told me immediately that she saw something changing in conservation, away from this notion of people coming in from the outside, setting up a park, and excluding people from entering the park. We also work with a group of Maasai women, and we give scholarships and we involve the community in what I think are meaningful activities, not throwing them a ball. Water projects, health projects, education projects. And one of the older women in that group stood up and said to me, I never thought that my decision to protect the life of an elephant would send my granddaughter to school. So I have to ask myself, what is worth more? Someone who believes that they now have a future because they looked to save elephants, or someone who is sated by getting some nutrients. Project in Malawi, working with the community on agricultural issues, and finding things that you never thought you would discover. This was a community that was very, very poor. They had problems with elephants. They had problems with wildlife conflict. About 20 people a year being killed by elephants, 30 people a year being killed by crocodiles because of the poaching that they engaged in going down to the river. IFAW worked with them to put up a fence, and I then learned that the women in tears, and the deputy minister in tears, told me that we literally had changed their lives. And I thought, well, she's being polite. But the reality was, she told me that there was an incredible problem of sexual harassment and rape. And that the women would never have to go into that forest again. And that they were safe. And that they would never allow anyone to destroy that fence that kept the elephants safe on that side and them safe on the other side. In closing, a story from Zimbabwe, which I think really captures the comment I made that I think that the elephants may be joining our efforts. So we focus at IFAW on rescue, rehabilitation, and then release into habitats that are secure. Working with a woman who has established a nursery, something that previously was seen as being overly emotional. Taking orphans, rehabilitating them, and then ultimately we're going to release those elephants. Instead of simply releasing them, we have leased land in partnership that was previously used as a trophy hunting concession. So you're taking land that was previously used as a killing ground and transforming it into a sanctuary. Why is that important beyond the fact that there will be a hunting ground? It is surrounded by two protected areas. And the elephants that are in those areas were so traumatized by what was happening in that trophy hunting concession that they wouldn't go there. So that corridor was destroyed. By releasing these young rehabilitated elephants into that space, they are in fact beginning to interact with those wild herds. They are beginning to communicate. The wild elephants are coming closer and closer. And so I would say that those elephants, in fact, are helping to bring together wild elephants in a way that hasn't been seen in many, many years. And that ultimately, that will become a natural form. So it's not just people. It's not just people who are capable of making those changes. With respect, it's also elephants who can make that change. So, in closing, before some of you may be asleep because it's so dark. What we are really after at IFAW is to see elephants and people thrive together. That we can change this notion of conservation where there's an enemy, and there's a fence, and there's people who want to keep people out and animals in. And that they accept that communities, in fact, are not the enemy, but they can be an incredible resource to make the changes that we need to make. And so I'll leave you with that notion, is that don't shut down, don't get discouraged. Know that we can survive together and that we can thrive together. I don't know if we have time for questions?
Yes.
All right. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks for the you just described two situations. One, you told that what is the economic value of the and the other side you also told about that the giving benefit of the community. So I think what I feel that the second one that we give the benefit of the community, I think that is what is your opinion? Because you giving the benefit of the community will help in conserving instead of setting the economic value.
I think that we have to give economic value. By and large, at least in an African context, I think that the promises that were made to people for a long time, 50, 60 years since independence. But the fact of the matter was that in some cases, people weren't even allowed into the park, even when there were burial grounds from their people. And that even today, by a very well-known conservationist, just wrote a paper saying we must abandon this notion that communities will be involved and go back to what I call fortress conservation. I just don't think it's realistic, particularly in places where the national park or the protected area is not a fenced area, right? So that statistic I gave you, 80% of some animals spend 80% of the time on community land. How can you not engage them? And as I said, I think that previously it was a form of tokenism. Well, we can do a hunt and people get to meet money into it, and talking, and I know Kelvin is going to share a group this afternoon, you look at the money that goes into conservation, agriculture, and economic development from various aid agencies, they see themselves so separate and apart. And just quickly, an example, I met with European Union out of Sabala, and they told me, well, listen, we have a 5-year plan, we just finished it, it's based on agriculture, and we don't deal with wildlife. And my response was, that's fine, but what I'm asking you is, before you planted all of that land, did you talk to any wildlife experts to see if in fact that is a correlate? And you could see the blood drain from his face. He said, what are you saying? I'm saying that probably everything you planted will be eaten by the elephants. So this notion of the amount of money that's put into economic development and the amount of money that's put into conservation, we could have accomplished so much more if we combined that. Because, let's be honest, a lot of the money goes in and then it's destroyed, and then you have another project and it's destroyed. And this notion that it's just charity, and we've broken away from this ourselves, and we raise money around the world, and we have people say, I want my money to go directly to the animals. And what I'll say is, but I can't feed the animals money. It's people. It's people. And so if you can keep girls in school, there's population impact on that. If you can keep people healthy, and most importantly, I think, if you can keep them secure. So one of the things that we do is work with communities from an intelligence point of view to ensure that the people themselves feel secure, and that they can eventually rise up into small business development. And then you take away, at least at the bottom line, any incentive for poaching. So it has to be real. It can't just be a token small grant. It has to be real development for communities.
Anyone else?